There exists a moment in every land when the veil between what is known and what remains hidden grows thin as morning mist. In the heart of medieval England, during an age when kings warred for thrones and common folk tilled soil that had nourished countless generations before them, such moments arrived without warning. The 12th century held its breath between darkness and illumination, between the old ways whispered around hearth fires and the newer faith proclaimed from stone churches. It was an era when anything seemed possible, when the forests stretched endlessly and their shadows concealed secrets no living soul could name. The year was somewhere in the reign of King Stephen, a monarch whose claim to the English crown remained forever contested, and whose kingdom knew little peace. Civil war had torn the realm asunder, siding baron against baron and scattering misery across the countryside like seeds in fallow ground. Yet even amid such turmoil, life continued in the smaller places. In the villages, tucked between woodlands and fields, where the greater struggles of nobles seemed distant as the stars, Woolpit took its name from the very earth upon which it stood. From the deep trenches dug into the ground that served a purpose both practical and grim. These were the wolf pits, excavations designed to trap the predators that stalked livestock and threatened the livelihood of every farmer who raised sheep upon the surrounding pastures. Wolves remained a genuine menace in those distant days, creatures of cunning and hunger that emerged from the dense forests to claim their prey under cover of darkness. The villagers had learned long ago that passive defense served better than active hunting, and so they carved these pits into the landscape. The pits themselves were engineering marvels of rustic simplicity, holes dug deep enough that no wolf could leap free once fallen within. Villagers covered them with branches and leaves, disguising them as solid ground, baiting the area with scraps of meat or the scent of animal blood. When morning came, the trappers would make their rounds, dispatching whatever unfortunate beast had stumbled into the snare during the night. Suffolk, in those times, was a patchwork of cultivated fields and ancient woodland, a place where human settlement existed in uneasy partnership with the wilderness that pressed in from every direction. The great forests of England had not yet been tamed, and their depths remained largely unexplored, home to deer and boar and creatures that the imagination peopled with far stranger inhabitants. Travelers spoke of losing their way among the endless trees, of walking for days without glimpsing the sun, of hearing sounds that belonged to no animal they could identify. Woolpit sat at the edge of such wilderness, a collection of perhaps several dozen households clustered around a modest church in the lands of the local lord. The dwellings were simple structures of timber and thatch, built low to the ground to conserve warmth and designed with practicality rather than beauty in mind. Smoke rose from central hearths through holes in the roofs. The smell of wood smoke mingled with the earthier scents of livestock and turned soil. The people of Woolpit were farmers, primarily, their existence bound to the land they worked and the crops they coaxed from the heavy clay soil of East Anglia. They grew wheat and barley, tended orchards of apples and pears, kept pigs that foraged in the woodland margins and chickens that scratched in every yard. Their lord claimed a portion of all they produced, and the church demanded its tithe, but enough remained to sustain families through most years if the weather proved cooperative. The rhythm of their days began before dawn, when the first pale light crept across the eastern horizon and the roosters announced the arrival of morning. Men went to the fields while women tended to the endless domestic tasks that kept households functioning. Children worked alongside their parents as soon as they were old enough to be useful, for idle hands were a luxury no peasant family could afford. By the time darkness fell, exhaustion claimed everyone, and sleep came swiftly to those who had labored from sunrise to sunset. Religion permeated every aspect of medieval existence, coloring perception and shaping understanding in ways that modern minds can scarcely comprehend. The villagers of Woolpit attended Mass regularly, received the sacraments, and believed with absolute conviction in the reality of heaven and hell. Angels watched over the faithful, while demons lurked in shadows, waiting to claim the souls of sinners. but older beliefs persisted beneath the veneer of Christian piety. Ideas that predated the arrival of missionaries and clung to the land like morning dew upon grass. The common folk whispered to spirits that dwelt in streams and wells, of entities that inhabited certain trees or stones, of beings neither wholly good nor wholly evil that existed alongside humanity in a parallel world rarely glimpsed but always present. These were the fairies, the fair folk, the hidden people whose origins stretched back into the mists of time immemorial. The forests especially were thought to harbor such entities, their depths providing refuge for creatures that shunned the light of day and the noise of human activity. Travelers who ventured into the woodland alone sometimes returned with strange tales, stories of lights glimpsed between the trees, of music heard where no musicians could possibly be playing, of figures seen from the corner of the eye that vanished when observed directly. Children were warned from an early age about the dangers of straying too far from the village, and these warnings encompassed more than the obvious threats of wolves and getting lost. There were those among the fair folk, the elders cautioned, who coveted human children, who would snatch the unwary and carry them off to realms from which no return was possible. Keyslings might be left in their place, strange substitutes that resembled the stolen child, but lacked some essential quality of soul or spirit. The landscape itself seemed designed to nurture such imaginings, for Suffolk possessed features that invited speculation about what might lie beneath or beyond the visible world. Ancient burial mounds dotted the countryside, reminders of peoples who had lived and died long before recorded history began. Standing stones marked boundaries or served purposes that no one any longer remembered. Old tracks wound through the forests, paths worn by feet that had ceased walking centuries past. In the summer months, when the days stretched long and the fields demanded constant attention, the pace of life in Woolpit accelerated to match the urgency of the harvest. Every able hand was needed to bring in the crops before the weather turned, and the entire community labored together in a shared effort that transcended individual concerns. The harvest season also brought heightened activity around the wolf pits, for this was when the predators grew bold in their efforts to claim livestock fattened on summer pasture. It was during one such harvest season, in a year that the chroniclers would later identify with varying precision, that the ordinary routine of checking the wolf pits produced a discovery unlike any the villagers of Woolpit had ever encountered. The morning began like countless mornings before it, with farmers rising early and setting out to inspect their traps before the day's labor in the fields commenced. The air was cool with the promise of autumn approaching, and dew sparkled on the grass as the first rays of sunlight pierced the eastern sky. The men walked in small groups, exchanging the casual conversation of neighbors who had known each other their entire lives, discussing the weather and the state of the crops and the gossip that passed for news in such isolated communities. They expected nothing out of the ordinary, for nothing out of the ordinary ever happened in Woolpit. When they reached the vicinity of the wolf pits, the routine proceeded as it always did, with each man approaching an assigned trap and peering within to assess what the night had delivered. Most of the pits were empty, their covering undisturbed, their depths holding nothing but shadows and the faint smell of earth. A few contained the expected catches, wolves that snarled and paced in futile circles. But one pit, set somewhat apart from the others, near the margin of the cultivated land where the fields gave way to forest, contained something entirely different. The farmer who discovered it stood motionless for a long moment, unable to comprehend what his eyes were telling him. Then he called out to his companions, his voice carrying a note of bewilderment that brought them running. They gathered at the edge of the pit and stared down into its depths, where two figures huddled together in obvious terror. The figures were small, the size of children, dressed in garments unlike any the villagers had ever seen, and their skin, clearly visible even in the dim light of the pit, displayed a hue that belonged to no human being any of them had ever encountered. These children, 4 children they appeared to be, despite everything else about them that defied explanation, were green. The moment stretched into eternity as the farmers struggled to process what they were witnessing. Some crossed themselves instinctively, invoking divine protection against whatever demonic manifestation this might prove to be. Others simply stared, their minds refusing to accept the evidence of their senses. The children stared back, their eyes wide with fear, their arms wrapped around each other as they pressed against the earthen wall of the pit. No one knew what to do. No precedent existed for such a situation. No tradition offered guidance for dealing with green-skinned children who appeared from nowhere. The farmers muttered among themselves, debating possibilities that ranged from practical to fantastical, from rational explanations that might account for the strange coloring to supernatural interpretations that invoked everything they had ever heard about the hidden folk. Eventually, someone suggested that they could not simply leave the children in the pit, regardless of what they were or where they had come from. Whatever their nature, they appeared helpless and frightened, and basic human compassion demanded some response beyond mere observation. So the farmers lowered a rope and gestured for the children to climb, hoping that this simple solution would work despite the obvious communication barrier. The children seemed to understand the purpose, if not the words, and slowly, hesitantly, they grasped the rope and allowed themselves to be pulled from the pit. When they emerged into the full light of morning, the green tint of their skin became even more apparent, a coloring that extended across their faces and hands, and presumably the rest of their bodies beneath their strange, woven clothing. They blinked against the brightness of the sun as though unaccustomed to such illumination, shielding their eyes and turning away from the light. The village of Woolpit had received visitors from another world entirely, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The mystery that began on that harvest morning would perplex generations of scholars and storytellers, inspiring theories and interpretations that spanned the entire range of human imagination. But on that first day, surrounded by astonished farmers who could not begin to explain what they were seeing, the 2 green children simply stood and shivered and waited to learn what fate had in store for them in this strange land of blinding light and incomprehensible speech. The 2 children stood blinking in the morning light, their small forms casting shadows upon grass still wet with dew. They clung to one another with the desperate grip of those who have lost everything familiar. Their fingers intertwined so tightly that the knuckles showed pale against the strange green hue of their skin. The farmers formed a loose circle around them, maintaining a cautious distance as though the children might at any moment reveal themselves to be something dangerous, something that required the space to flee or the room to defend. In the full illumination of day, the peculiarity of their appearance became impossible to deny or dismiss as a trick of shadow and underground darkness. Their skin held a definite greenish cast, not the green of grass or leaves, but something more subtle, more like the color of unripe fruit or the tint that pond water takes on in certain lights. It covered every visible inch of them, their faces and necks, and the small hands that clutched at each other. Uniform in its strangeness and undeniable in its reality, the older of the 2 appeared to be a girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years of age by the reckoning of those who observed her. Her hair was dark and tangled, hanging about her face in unkempt strands that suggested she had been traveling or lost for some considerable time. Her features were delicate but drawn with exhaustion and fear, her eyes darting from face to face among the gathered villagers as though searching for some sign of recognition or understanding. She found neither, only the same bewildered stares that met her gaze wherever it landed. The younger child was a boy, smaller and seemingly more fragile, who pressed himself against his companion, as though she alone stood between him and whatever terrors this new world might hold. His green-tinged face was streaked with the tracks of tears, and his body trembled with a constant shiver that spoke of cold or shock, or both. He would not meet the eyes of the adults who surrounded them, keeping his gaze fixed upon the ground, or upon his sister. Refusing to acknowledge the existence of this place into which they had so inexplicably emerged. Their garments drew nearly as much attention as their unusual coloring. The cloth from which their clothes were fashioned resembled nothing the villagers had ever encountered. It was woven in a peculiar manner, the threads interlaced in patterns that seemed almost random, yet held together with surprising integrity. The color of the fabric defied easy description, shifting between shades of brown and gray and something else entirely, depending on how the light struck it. The style of the clothing itself was equally unfamiliar, wrapped and folded in ways that served their purpose but followed no fashion known in England or any neighboring land. One of the farmers, bolder than his companions, or simply more curious, stepped forward and spoke to the children in a slow and deliberate voice. He asked them their names, where they had come from, how they had found themselves in the Woolpit on the edge of Woolpit village. His tone was gentle, despite his obvious unease, the voice one might use to calm a frightened animal or soothe a crying infant. He expected no answer, for surely these strange beings could not understand the tongue of honest English folk. Connie, the girl, looked up at him when he spoke, expression shifting from fear to something like concentration as she listened to the sounds he produced. Then she opened her mouth and replied, and every person present felt their confusion deepen into something approaching alarm. The words she spoke were utterly incomprehensible, a string of syllables that followed patterns and rhythms unlike any language the farmers had ever heard. It was not French, which some among them knew well enough to recognize. It was not the Latin of the church, nor the remnants of the old tongue that lingered in place names and ancient sayings. The sound of her voice was musical in its way, rising and falling in cadences that suggested meaning, even if the meaning itself remained impenetrable. She spoke at some length, her small hands moving in gestures that might have been attempts to supplement her words with visual communication. The boy added his own voice to hers, a higher and more tremulous contribution that carried the same alien quality, the same complete failure to connect with anything the listeners could comprehend. The villagers exchanged glances laden with unspoken questions. What manner of beings were these who spoke in tongues unknown to mortal ears and wore clothing fashioned by hands that clearly did not belong to any craftsman of the known world? Some among the gathered crowd began to mutter about demons and spirits, about creatures from the hollow hills who were said to steal away human children and leave their own kind in exchange. The green coloring seemed to support such theories, for green was the color of the fairy folk in all the old stories, the shade they favored for their garments and the tint that sometimes marked their otherworldly flesh. Others argued for more earthly explanations, suggesting that the children might be foreigners from some distant land beyond the seas, travelers who had become separated from their party and wandered, lost until chance delivered them into the wolf pit. The green hue of their skin might be the result of some illness or some property of the food they ate in their homeland, strange but ultimately natural in origin. These voices counseled patience and observation rather than the fear that threatened to take hold of the assembly. The parish priest was summoned, for surely a man of God would know how to determine whether these beings were natural or supernatural in origin. He arrived shortly, a thin and weathered figure whose eyes had seen much in his years of service to the village. He studied the children with the careful attention of one accustomed to evaluating souls, looking for signs of demonic possession or divine favor or simple human distress. What he found left him as uncertain as everyone else. He spoke to them in Latin, the universal language of the church, hoping that if they were indeed creatures of another realm, they might recognize the sacred tongue. The children showed no more comprehension of his words than they had of the farmer's English, though the girl attempted another response in her own mysterious language. The priest crossed himself and muttered a prayer, then announced that he could not say what these children were, but that they did not appear to be actively malevolent. Their fear seemed genuine, their distress authentic, their helplessness real. The question of what to do with them remained unanswered as the morning advanced and the demands of harvest pressed upon the community. They could not simply be left standing in the field, two lost waifs with green skin and empty bellies, and nowhere in all the world to call home. Someone would have to take responsibility for them, provide them shelter and sustenance until their nature and origin could be better understood. The farmers looked at one another, each hoping someone else would volunteer for this uncertain duty. Word of the discovery had by now spread throughout the village, and curious onlookers began to arrive at the edge of the fields. Women and children came to see the green strangers for themselves, adding their voices to the speculation and their eyes to the examination. The children shrank from this increased attention, the girl drawing her brother closer and positioning herself between him and the growing crowd. Her protective instinct was unmistakably human, whatever else about her might be strange. Among those who came to witness the spectacle was a servant from the household of Sir Richard de Colin, the local landowner whose manor stood at the center of the village's social hierarchy. This servant reported what she had seen to her master, and Sir Richard's curiosity was sufficiently aroused that he sent word for the children to be brought to him. A knight of his standing had seen much of the world beyond Woolpit, had traveled to distant places and encountered peoples of various kinds. Perhaps he would recognize something in these strange visitors that the common folk had missed. The children were led through the village toward the manor house, their progress observed by every person they passed. They walked slowly, their steps uncertain on the hard-packed earth of the road, their eyes still squinting against the brightness of the daylight. The girl kept her arm around her brother's shoulders, guiding him forward, even as she herself had no idea where they were being taken or what awaited them at the end of their journey. The manor of Sir Richard de Colin was by far the grandest structure in Woolpit, a building of stone and timber that rose above its surroundings, like a lord above his peasants. To the children from the wolf pit, it must have seemed impossibly large and strange. This house, with its multiple rooms and its glazed windows and its chimneys that drew smoke upward rather than letting it escape through holes in the roof. They hesitated at the threshold, reluctant to enter yet another unknown space in this world of perpetual bewilderment. Sir Richard received them in his great hall, a chamber hung with tapestries and warmed by a fire that blazed in the enormous hearth. He was a man of middle years, his face marked by the weather of many campaigns and the responsibility of governing those who depended upon him. He examined the children with the same careful scrutiny the priest had employed, noting their unusual coloring and their foreign garments and the obvious bond of affection that connected them despite their dire circumstances. He, too, attempted to communicate with them, trying not only English and Latin, but also scraps of French, and even a few words of the Flemish tongue he had picked up during his travels. Nothing produced a spark of recognition. No language bridged the gulf between his world and theirs. The children responded to each attempt with their own unintelligible speech, clearly trying to make themselves understood, equally clearly failing to achieve that goal. Food was brought. For whatever else these children might be, they appeared hungry and in need of nourishment. The servants laid before them bread and meat and cheese, simple fare that would have delighted any peasant child in the village. Yet the Green children showed no interest in these offerings, sniffing at them cautiously and then turning away with expressions of distaste or confusion. They would not eat the bread, would not touch the meat, refused even to taste the fresh milk that was poured for them. This refusal sparked new concerns among those who witnessed it. What manner of creature declined good Christian food, sustenance that had been blessed by the labor of honest hands and the grace of God? Some whispered that this proved the children's demonic nature, for surely beings of the devil could not stomach provisions meant for human consumption. Others suggested that their homeland must be so different from England that even the most basic foods were unfamiliar to them. No more appetizing than grass or dirt would be to an English child. The girls seemed to understand that their refusal to eat was causing distress, and she made efforts to explain through gesture what she could not convey through words. She pointed at the food and shook her head, then rubbed her stomach and made a face that suggested the problem was not lack of hunger, but unsuitability of what was offered. She looked around the hall as though searching for something, some alternative that might serve where bread and meat had failed. The hours passed, and still the children would not eat, their weakness growing more apparent as the day wore on. The boy especially seemed to fade, small body slumping against his sister as though standing required more energy than he possessed. Sir Richard and his household watched with mounting concern. For whatever mysteries surrounded these visitors, their suffering was real and immediate. Something had to be found that they could eat, some nourishment their strange constitutions would accept. And so began the long process of discovery that would eventually reveal what the Green Children could consume. What would sustain them in this world so different from wherever they had originated? The answer, when it came, would prove as unusual as everything else about them. Another piece of the puzzle that scholars would debate for centuries to come. The household of Sir Richard de Colin had never faced a challenge quite like the one presented by the two Green Children who now resided within its walls. Days passed, and still they refused all food that was offered to them, growing weaker with each sunrise that found them still unable or unwilling to consume the sustenance that kept ordinary humans alive. The servants tried everything they could imagine, presenting the children with an ever-changing array of provisions in the hope that something would prove acceptable to their mysterious guests. Porridge was offered and declined. Eggs prepared in various fashions met the same fate. Fruits from the orchard, vegetables from the garden, preserved meats from the larder, fresh fish from the nearby streams, all were rejected with the same expression of sorrowful refusal. The children clearly wanted to eat, their hunger evident in their hollow cheeks and their desperate eyes. Yet, whatever affliction or difference governed their bodies prevented them from accepting what was placed before them. The girl attempted repeatedly to communicate what they needed, her hands moving in elaborate pantomimes that the household struggled to interpret. She would point at certain foods and shake her head, then gesture toward other things with what seemed like hopeful inquiry. When green rushes were brought in to freshen the floor of the hall, she examined them with particular interest, but even these proved unsuitable for whatever she was seeking. Sir Richard consulted with the priest and with the wisest members of the village, seeking any insight that might save these strange children from starving to death under his roof. Smith suggested that fairy folk, if indeed that was what these beings were, could only eat food from their own realm, that mortal provisions would poison them or pass through their bodies without providing nourishment. Others proposed that the children might be under some enchantment that could only be broken by finding the precise substance their captor had designated for their survival. The boy grew weaker more rapidly than his sister, his small frame having fewer reserves to draw upon during this extended fast. He spent most of his time lying on the pallet that had been prepared for the children, his eyes closed and his breathing shallow, while his sister sat beside him and stroked his hair and spoke to him in their private language. The bond between them was evident to all who witnessed these tender moments. It's a connection that transcended whatever strangeness surrounded their presence in this world. It was on perhaps the 5th or 6th day of their residence at the manor that the breakthrough finally came, arriving as so many important discoveries do through a combination of accident and observation. A servant was carrying a bundle of freshly harvested beans through the hall. Broad beans still in their pods that had been gathered from the kitchen garden for the evening meal. The Green Children, who had shown no interest in any previous food that passed through their presence, suddenly became animated at the sight of these vegetables. The girl rose from her brother's side and approached the servant with an eagerness she had not displayed since her arrival in Woolpit. She pointed at the beans and spoke rapidly in her incomprehensible tongue, her face alight with something that looked remarkably like hope. When the servant hesitated, uncertain whether to surrender the vegetables to these strange beings, the girl reached out and took one of the pods from the bundle, examining it with intense concentration. She tried to eat the pod itself, biting into the tough green casing with teeth that had known nothing but hunger for nearly a week. The exterior proved too fibrous to consume, and her face fell with disappointment as she struggled to extract any nourishment from the unyielding shell. Those watching might have concluded that this too was a false lead, another failed attempt to find something the children could eat. But then one of the servants, whether through kindness or curiosity, took a pod from the bundle and demonstrated how to open it, splitting the seam with practiced fingers to reveal the pale beans nestled within their verdant cradle. The girl watched this operation with rapt attention, and when the servant offered her the opened pod, she seized upon the beans within with a cry of unmistakable joy. She ate the beans as quickly as she could extract them from their pods, her fingers fumbling with hunger and haste as she split open shell after shell to reach the nourishment inside. The servant brought more pods, and she continued eating until her desperate hunger finally began to subside. Then she turned to her brother and carried beans to him, placing them in his mouth and encouraging him to chew and swallow. The boy ate more slowly, his weakness making even the simple act of chewing an exhausting effort, but he ate nonetheless. For the first time since their discovery in the wolf pit, the Green children were consuming food, sustaining their bodies with something from this strange world into which they had so inexplicably arrived. The household watched with relief and wonder as the two small figures methodically worked their way through a substantial portion of the bean harvest. This discovery of the beans as acceptable sustenance raised as many questions as it answered. Why could these children eat only this particular vegetable when all other foods repulsed them? What property of the broad bean made it compatible with their unusual constitutions when bread and meat and every other provision had failed? Some noted that the beans were green, matching the color of the children's skin, and wondered if there was some significance to this correspondence. Others suggested that beans might be the primary food source in whatever land the children had come from, and thus the only thing their bodies recognized as edible. For a time, the household fed the children nothing but beans, ensuring a steady supply of the vegetables that alone seemed capable of keeping them alive. The girl adapted to this diet with relative ease, her strength returning as the days passed and her body received the nourishment it had been denied. She became more active, more curious about her surroundings, more willing to engage with the people who had taken her in. The boy's recovery proved more difficult, his earlier weakness having taken a toll from which he struggled to recuperate. He ate when food was brought to him and slept for long hours between meals, his small body fighting to rebuild what the period of starvation had cost him. His sister rarely left his side, tending to him with a devotion that touched the hearts of all who witnessed it. Sir Richard de Colin made the decision to keep the children in his household rather than returning them to the village or consigning them to the care of the church. His reasons for this choice were never fully explained, though curiosity surely played a role. Here were beings unlike any he had ever encountered, visitors from some realm beyond the knowledge of ordinary men, and he was not inclined to surrender such a mystery to others who might treat it with less care. The children were given a small chamber of their own, a luxury that most peasant children could scarcely have imagined. They were provided with clothing more suited to the English climate than the strange woven garments in which they had arrived. Though the girl in particular seemed reluctant to abandon her original attire entirely, they were treated with a kindness that exceeded what their ambiguous status might have warranted. Neither servants nor guests, but something in between, objects of fascination and concern. Gradually, the girl began to acquire words in the English tongue, learning to name the objects around her and to express simple needs and desires. Her progress was slow at first, hindered by the vast gulf between her native language and the speech of her hosts, but she possessed a quick mind and a determination to bridge the gap that separated her from the only people who could help her survive. Within weeks, She could make herself understood in basic matters, and her vocabulary expanded steadily as the months passed. The boy showed less aptitude for language, or perhaps less interest, his attention consumed by the ongoing struggle to regain his health. He remained weak and listless, even as his sister grew stronger, his green-tinged face gaunt, and his eyes dull with an exhaustion that sleep could not seem to remedy. The household watched his decline with growing concern, recognizing the signs of a spirit that was slowly surrendering its grip on life. Whether it was the trauma of whatever journey had brought him to the wolf pit, or the damage inflicted by the period of starvation, or simply a constitution too fragile for the demands of this new existence, the boy failed to thrive in the way his sister did. He ate the beans that were brought to him, and he slept in the warm chamber that had been provided. But something essential within him continued to fade despite these comforts. The girl cared for him with tireless dedication, sitting beside him through the long nights and speaking to him in their shared language. Perhaps telling him stories from their homeland, or simply offering the comfort of a familiar voice in this world of strangers. She fed him when he was too weak to feed himself, and held his hand when the fear overwhelmed him, and sang soft songs in the twilight hours when the manor fell quiet around them. But love alone cannot always defeat the forces that pull a soul toward darkness. And despite his sister's efforts, the boy continued his slow descent. His breathing grew more labored, his periods of wakefulness shorter, his interest in the world around him dimmer. The priest was summoned to offer what spiritual comfort he could, though the question of whether these green children possessed souls susceptible to Christian salvation remained theologically uncertain. The boy died on a night when rain fell softly against the windows of the manor and the fire in the hall burned low. His sister was beside him when he drew his final breath, her hand clasping his as the life departed from his small body. She did not cry out or weep in the manner of English mourners, but sat in silence for a long time, her face bearing an expression of grief so profound that words would only have diminished it. The household observed her sorrow and felt their own, for whatever these children had been, the boy had become in his brief time among them a subject of genuine sympathy. His death seemed a tragedy, regardless of his mysterious origins. The loss of a young life that had barely begun to experience the world. The servants wept, and the priest prayed, and Sir Richard himself stood in quiet contemplation of the strange fate that had brought this child to die so far from whatever home he had known. The boy was buried in the churchyard of Woolpit, laid to rest in consecrated ground, despite the lingering questions about his nature and the state of his soul. The priest reasoned that he had never shown any sign of demonic influence, had never done anything to harm those around him, and had suffered enough in his short life to deserve whatever peace the grave could offer. A simple marker was placed above his resting place, bearing no name because no one had ever learned what his name might be. The girl stood at her brother's graveside as the earth was placed over his small body, her green face wet now with the tears she had held back in the chamber of his death. She was alone in this world, the last survivor of whatever catastrophe had delivered them into the wolf pit, the only one who remembered the land they had left behind and the life they had lived before everything changed. She turned away from the grave and walked back toward the manor that had become her home, her small figure casting a long shadow in the afternoon light. The seasons turned in their eternal procession, carrying the village of Woolpit from harvest into the lean months of winter and eventually toward the promise of spring. Throughout this passage of time, the surviving green child remained in the household of Sir Richard de Colin, gradually adapting to a life she could never have imagined in whatever distant realm had been her birthplace. The grief for her brother did not leave her, but it softened with the passing months into something she could carry without being crushed beneath its weight. Her diet expanded slowly beyond the beans that had initially been her sole sustenance, whether through necessity or through the gradual adjustment of her body to its new environment. She began to accept other foods, trying small amounts of bread and eventually tolerating vegetables and fruits that she had previously refused. A key remained difficult for her, and she never developed a taste for the flesh of animals. But she learned to survive on a diet more varied than the beans alone could provide. The most remarkable change, however, was the one that occurred in her appearance. The green tint that had so distinguished her upon her arrival began to fade, slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably as the months accumulated. Her skin lightened toward the ordinary hues of the English people around her, the strange coloring retreating like frost before the morning sun. By the time a full year had passed since her discovery in the wolf pit, she looked almost entirely like any other young girl in the village. This transformation sparked intense discussion among those who had witnessed her original appearance and now observed her altered state. Some saw in it proof that the green color had been the result of illness or malnutrition, a symptom that naturally resolved once she received proper care and adequate food. The broadening of her diet seemed to support this theory, suggesting that her body had been starved of essential nutrients in her homeland and was now recovering its proper function. Others maintained that the change proved something far more mysterious, that she was being slowly absorbed into this world, her otherworldly nature gradually giving way to something more human. Those who believed she had come from the realm of the fairies noted that such beings were said to change when they remained too long in the mortal world, losing the qualities that marked them as different and becoming indistinguishable from ordinary folk. Whether this represented a loss or a liberation depended upon the perspective of the observer. The girl herself offered no explanation for the change, either because she did not understand it or because her growing command of English remained insufficient to express such complex matters. She accepted her altered appearance without apparent distress, perhaps even with relief, for the green skin had marked her as strange and invited stares wherever she went. Now she could walk through the village without drawing quite so much attention, could blend into the crowds on market days and feast days without feeling the weight of 100 curious gazes. Her acquisition of the English language continued steadily, her vocabulary expanding and her grammar improving until she could carry on conversations of reasonable complexity. She learned the names of everything around her, the words for tools and animals and weather, and the countless small details that made up daily existence in a medieval village. She listened carefully when others spoke and asked questions when she did not understand, displaying an intelligence that impressed even those who remained uncertain about her origins. The household of Sir Richard de Colin became her family in all the ways that mattered, the servants treating her with a mixture of affection and lingering wonder. She was given tasks appropriate to her age and abilities, learning to assist with the domestic work that kept the manor functioning. She proved willing and capable, eager to make herself useful to the people who had saved her life and provided her with a home when she had nothing and no one in all the world. Her baptism was arranged once her command of English had progressed sufficiently that she could understand the meaning of the sacrament she was receiving. The priest, who had first examined her upon her arrival, now welcomed her into the Christian faith, pouring holy water over her head and pronouncing the words that were believed to cleanse the soul of sin and open the gates of heaven to the faithful. She was given the name Agnes, a proper English name for a girl who was becoming more English with each passing day. The choice of name carried significance beyond mere identification, for Agnes was the name of a Christian martyr, a virgin saint who had died rather than renounce her faith, bestowing this name upon the girl from the wolf pit. The priest and the community were making a statement about her transformation, declaring that whatever she had been before, she was now one of them, a member of the body of Christ and a participant in the promise of salvation. Agnes accepted her new identity with the same quiet adaptability she had shown in every other aspect of her transition. She attended church services regularly, learning the prayers and responses that structured medieval worship. She observed the holy days and participated in the rituals that marked the passage of the Christian calendar. Whether she truly understood or believed in the faith she had adopted, or whether she simply recognized that conformity was necessary for survival, remained known only to her own heart. The village of Woolpit gradually absorbed her presence, the initial sensation of her arrival fading into acceptance, and eventually something approaching normalcy. Children who had once pointed and whispered now played with her in the lanes between houses. Women who had crossed themselves at the sight of her green skin now greeted her by name when they met at the well. Men who had debated whether she was demon or fairy now nodded to her as they would to any young girl of the community. She grew taller as the years passed, her body maturing from childhood into adolescence and eventually into womanhood. The green tint of her skin became nothing more than a memory, a story that the older villagers told to newcomers who had not witnessed those strange early days. She was Agnes now, a member of the household of Sir Richard de Callan, baptized, Christian, and resident of Woolpit, mysterious origins fading into the background of a life that looked increasingly ordinary. As she reached the age when young women typically married, the question of her future arose with new urgency. She was pretty enough, her features refined, and her manner gentle. But her background presented complications that ordinary matchmaking did not face. What man would take a wife whose origins were so uncertain, whose first years had been spent in some realm no one could identify, whose very humanity had once been a matter of serious debate? The answer came in the form of a man from the nearby town of Len, a community some distance from Woolpit that had heard only vague rumors of the Green Children and their peculiar story. This man, whose name the chronicles do not record, found in Agnes a wife who pleased him, whatever her history might contain. Perhaps he did not fully believe the tales of her green skin and her mysterious arrival. Perhaps he simply did not care, finding in her present virtues sufficient reason to overlook any strangeness in her past. The marriage was performed according to the customs of the time, with the blessing of the church and the approval of Sir Richard de Callan, who had served as something like a father to Agnes during her years in his household. She left Woolpit to begin her new life in Len, departing from the village that had witnessed her emergence from the wolf pit, and her slow transformation into an ordinary English woman. Those who had known her since her arrival watched her go with mixed emotions, glad for her happiness, yet sorry to lose the last living connection to that extraordinary morning. Agnes lived out her days in Len, bearing children and keeping house and participating in the mundane routines that defined existence for most women of her era. The account suggests that she was generally considered somewhat loose in her conduct and morals, a description that admits various interpretations. Perhaps she retained some quality from her original homeland that did not quite align with English expectations of female behavior. Perhaps she simply struggled to conform entirely to standards that had not been instilled in her from birth. She apparently spoke freely about her origins to those who asked, sharing what she remembered of her homeland and the circumstances of her journey to Woolpit. These conversations provided the details that would eventually find their way into the written chronicles, the only record of her testimony that survived the centuries without her willingness to discuss her past. The story of the Green Children would have remained forever incomplete, a mystery without even the partial explanations that make it so fascinating to those who encounter it. The children she bore were apparently normal in every respect, showing no trace of the green coloring that had distinguished their mother upon her arrival in England. Whatever quality had produced that strange hue did not pass to the next generation, whether because it had never been genetic in nature or because it had been so thoroughly purged from her system during her years of transformation. Her descendants blended seamlessly into the population of East Anglia, their extraordinary ancestry known only to those who preserved the family memory. Agnes lived long enough to become an old woman, to see her children grown, and perhaps to hold grandchildren in her arms. The exact date and circumstances of her death went unrecorded, for by then she was simply another resident of Len. Her remarkable story filed away in the chronicles of learned monks who found such accounts worthy of preservation. She was buried in consecrated ground like any other Christian woman, a soul commended to the God she had learned to worship in this world so different from the one she had known. The village of Woolpit remembered her long after she had gone, adding her story to the legends that accumulated around places where the ordinary and extraordinary had once intersected. The wolf pit, where she and her brother had been discovered, became a site of local significance, pointed out to travelers and visitors as the location of an event that had briefly torn the veil between worlds. The church where she had been baptized preserved the memory of the strange green girl who had received her Christian name within its walls. Her brother remained in the churchyard where he had been buried all those years before, his unmarked grave gradually becoming indistinguishable from the other resting places of the village dead. He had never learned to speak English, never eaten anything beyond the beans that had sustained him so inadequately, never adapted to the life that his sister had eventually embraced. His story ended where it began, in mystery and sorrow, a brief passage through a world that had offered him only confusion and pain. But Agnes had survived, had transformed, had built a life from the wreckage of whatever catastrophe had delivered her into that wolf pit on a harvest morning long ago. Her survival was itself a kind of miracle, a testament to human resilience and adaptability in the face of circumstances that would have broken a lesser spirit. She had lost everything she had known, her home and her people and her brother, and even the color of her own skin. Yet she had found a way to continue. The legacy she left behind was not measured in monuments or great deeds, but in the simple fact of her persistence, her determination to live despite everything that had been taken from her, in a world that offered few protections to those who did not fit neatly into established categories. She had carved out a place for herself through patience and accommodation in the gradual accumulation of small acceptances. She had become, against all probability, an ordinary woman, and in that ordinariness lay an achievement more remarkable than any legend could capture. The most precious gift that Agnes left to posterity was not her adaptation to English life or the children she bore in her years at Lynn, but rather the account she provided of the land from which she had come and the journey that had delivered her and her brother into that wolf pit on the edge of Woolpit village. She shared this testimony with those who asked, and through their retellings it eventually reached the ears of the chroniclers who would preserve it in written form for future generations to contemplate. She called her homeland St. Martin's Land, a name that carried Christian connotations, yet described a place utterly unlike any Christian realm the people of England had ever heard of. Whether the land had truly been named for the saint, or whether Agnes simply used this designation to make her origins more comprehensible to her English audience, remained unclear. The name itself became part of the mystery, a label that answered nothing while suggesting depths of strangeness that lay beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. The most striking feature of St. Martin's Land, according to Agnes's account, was its light, or rather, the peculiar quality of illumination that prevailed throughout that distant realm. There was no sun in the sky, as the people of England knew the sun. No brilliant orb that rose each morning and set each evening to divide the hours into day and night. Instead, a perpetual twilight held sway over the landscape, a gentle dimness that never brightened into full daylight and never deepened into complete darkness. Imagine a world caught forever in the moment just after sunset, when the sky still holds the memory of departed light, but the stars have not yet emerged to claim their dominion. Imagine living all your days in that soft, gray interval, never seeing shadows sharp and black upon the ground, never squinting against the glare of noon, never watching the colors of dawn paint the eastern horizon. This was the light of St. Martin's Land as Agnes described it, a dim and constant glow that bathed everything in gentle obscurity. The inhabitants of this twilight realm had adapted to their environment in ways that became tragically apparent when the children emerged into the brightness of an English morning. Their eyes were suited to the soft light of their homeland, sensitive to gradations of shadow that would be invisible to ordinary humans, but overwhelmed by the intensity of direct sunlight. When the farmers pulled them from the wolf pit and they first faced the full blaze of day, experienced something like pain, a visual assault that sent them reeling backward with their hands raised to shield their faces. Agnes spoke of the people among whom she had lived, describing them in terms that suggested they were human in most respects, yet distinct in their appearance and customs. They dressed in garments woven from materials unfamiliar to English minds, ate foods that did not grow in English soil, spoke a language that bore no relationship to any tongue known in the wider world. They lived their lives in the eternal dusk, going about their business without the rhythm of day and night that structured existence for everyone else. The green coloring of her skin, she indicated, was common among her people, a natural characteristic rather than a mark of illness or supernatural origin. Whether this hue resulted from their diet or their environment or some quality inherent to their race, she could not say with certainty. It was simply how they were, how they had always been. Unremarkable within the context of St. Martin's Land, even if it marked them as extraordinary elsewhere. She remembered her life before the journey with the fragmentary clarity of childhood memory, recalling images and impressions rather than detailed narratives. There had been a home, a family beyond just her brother, a community of green-skinned people living their twilight existence in whatever corner of creation St. Martin's Land occupied. She had been happy there, or at least content, knowing nothing of the bright world that lay beyond the boundaries of everything she had ever experienced. The circumstances that led to her departure from this homeland were themselves shrouded in confusion, the recollections of a child caught up in events she did not fully understand. She and her brother had been tending their family's flocks, she said, watching over animals in the dim pastures that surrounded their dwelling. This detail suggested an agricultural society, not entirely unlike the one that existed in medieval England. People who raised livestock and depended upon the care of their herds for survival. While engaged in this pastoral duty, they had heard something that drew their attention away from the animals they were supposed to be guarding. It was the sound of bells, she told her listeners, the ringing of church bells carrying across the landscape from some distant source. The sound was beautiful and strange, unlike anything they had encountered in their twilight world, and it called to them with an insistence that proved impossible to resist. They followed the sound, she and her brother, leaving behind their flocks and their responsibilities as they traced the ringing bells across the dim terrain of St. Martin's Land. The sound seemed to come from a particular direction, and they walked toward it with the heedless curiosity of children who do not yet understand that the world contains dangers as well as wonders. Their parents must have warned them about straying too far, about the perils that lurked beyond the familiar boundaries of home. But in that moment, such warnings were forgotten. The pursuit of the bells led them to the entrance of a cavern, a dark opening in the earth that seemed to be the source of the mysterious sound. The ringing echoed from within, amplified by the stone walls of the underground passage, calling them forward into depths that should have frightened any sensible child. But the sound was so beautiful, so compelling, that fear could not compete with the desire to discover its origin. They entered the cavern and began to walk, following the passage as it wound through the earth in directions they could not track. The darkness of the underground was not so different from the perpetual twilight of their homeland, and their eyes adjusted easily to the absence of even that dim illumination. They walked for what seemed like a very long time, though children are poor judges of duration, and Agnes could not say with certainty how many hours or days the journey consumed. The ringing of the bells continued to guide them, sometimes seeming closer and sometimes more distant, leading them ever onward through the subterranean maze. They did not think to turn back, did not consider that they might be losing their way in passages that could never be retraced. The sound held them in its power, drawing them forward with a force that felt less like choice than like destiny. And then, without warning, They emerged from the darkness into light, such as they had never imagined possible. The cavern opened onto the surface of another world, a world where the sun blazed in a sky of impossible blue, and every color seemed to shout with an intensity that bordered on violence. They stumbled out of the passage and into this brightness, immediately blinded and disoriented, their eyes screaming in protest against the assault of illumination. They wandered in confusion, unable to see clearly, unable to understand where they were or how to return to the comforting dimness of home. The landscape around them was incomprehensible, filled with shapes and colors that their twilight-adapted vision could not properly process. They must have walked for some time in this state of bewildered helplessness, somehow avoiding the dangers that might have claimed them. They stumbled into the wolf pit that would become the site of their discovery. Agnes remembered the fall, the sudden disappearance of ground beneath their feet, the painful impact at the bottom of the trap. She remembered the terror of finding themselves confined in a dark hole after their ordeal in the blinding light, uncertain whether this was rescue or simply another form of danger. She remembered holding her brother close throughout the night, listening to strange sounds above them and waiting for whatever would come with the morning. She spoke also of something she had seen from St. Martin's Land, a vision that added another layer of mystery to her already extraordinary account. Across a great river that bordered her homeland, she said, there lay another country, a luminous land that glowed with a light far brighter than anything in the twilight realm. She had seen this country from a distance, observed its radiance across the waters that separated it from St. Martin's Land, wondered what manner of beings might dwell in such brilliant surroundings. This luminous country she had never visited, knew nothing about, beyond what could be discerned from afar, but its presence suggested that the geography of wherever Agnes had come from was complex, containing multiple realms with different qualities of light and, perhaps, different inhabitants. St. Martin's Land was not alone in its corner of creation, but existed in proximity to other places that were themselves strange and wonderful. The church bells that had lured them from their home and into the cavern would never explain to the satisfaction of those who heard the story. No church existed in St. Martin's Land, Agnes indicated, no Christian worship of the sort that would produce such sounds. Where then had the bells been ringing, and why had they sounded across the twilight realm at precisely the moment when two children were positioned to hear them? Some suggested that the bells of Woolpit's own church, or perhaps of Bury St. Edmund's nearby, had somehow penetrated into that other world, calling the children toward the passage that would deliver them into England. Others proposed more mystical explanations, suggesting that the bells were not physical sounds at all, but spiritual summons, calls from the divine intended to bring these lost souls into the light of Christianity. The fact that Agnes eventually accepted baptism and lived as a Christian woman seemed to support such interpretations, as though her entire journey had been ordained by Providence for the salvation of her soul. Agnes herself could not say what the bells had been, or why they had called to her with such irresistible force. She reported what she remembered, the sound and the pursuit and the cavern and the light. But the meaning behind these experiences remained as mysterious to her as to anyone else. She had been a child following a beautiful sound, and that sound had led her out of everything she had ever known and into a life she could never have anticipated. The cavern through which they had traveled was never found. Despite searches conducted by curious parties hoping to discover the passage to St. Martin's Land, no opening in the earth near Woolpit led to underground passages of the sort Agnes described. No tunnel connected the wolf pits to any subterranean network that might span the distance between worlds. Either the entrance had closed behind the children, sealing the route they had traveled, or it existed in a form that defied ordinary discovery. Her testimony raised as many questions as it answered, providing tantalizing details while leaving the fundamental mysteries intact. Where was St. Martin's Land, and did it still exist somewhere beyond the reach of those who sought it? What had happened to the family and community she had left behind? And did they wonder still about the two children who had vanished while tending the flocks? Could anyone else make the journey she had made, following the sound of bells through underground passages into a world of blinding light? These questions would occupy scholars and dreamers for centuries to come, each generation finding in Agnes's account new possibilities to explore and new theories to propose. Our words became the foundation upon which all subsequent speculation was built, the primary source that made the Green Children something more than mere legend. She had spoken, and through her speech, the mystery had been preserved, waiting for minds not yet born to take up the endless work of interpretation. The story of the Green Children might have vanished into the mists of time, forgotten like countless other strange occurrences that have touched human communities throughout history, were it not for the diligence of medieval chroniclers who considered such accounts worthy of preservation. Two men in particular took up their pens to record the events at Woolpit, setting down in Latin the details that would carry this mystery across the centuries to reach audiences the original witnesses could never have imagined. Ralph of Coggeshall was an abbot who presided over a Cistercian monastery in Essex, not far from the Suffolk village where the Green Children had appeared. His chronicle, compiled in the early years of the 13th century, included an account of the Woolpit incident among the many notable events he deemed worthy of recording. Ralph was a careful man, attentive to detail and concerned with accuracy, and his version of the story reflects the thoroughness one might expect from a religious administrator accustomed to keeping precise records. According to Ralph's account, he had spoken directly with Sir Richard de Colon, the knight who had taken the Green Children into his household and who had witnessed their transformation firsthand. This claim of direct testimony lends particular weight to his version of events, suggesting that his narrative derived not from rumor or hearsay, but from the words of someone who had actually participated in the story. Sir Richard, by the time of their conversation, would have had years to reflect upon what had happened, years to consider the meaning of the strange visitors who had so briefly disrupted the ordinary rhythms of his life. Ralph recorded the essential elements of the tale with the precision of a man trained to document important matters. He described the discovery of the children in the wolf pit, their green coloring, their incomprehensible language, their initial refusal to eat anything except green beans. He noted the death of the boy and the survival of the girl, her gradual transformation and eventual marriage. He preserved Agnes's testimony about St. Martin's Land, the twilight realm, and the sound of bells, and the journey through underground passages. The other major chronicler of the Green Children was William of Newburgh, canon of the Augustinian Priory in Yorkshire, who composed his History of England in the final years of the 12th century. William was a different sort of writer than Ralph, more skeptical by temperament, and more inclined to question the reliability of the marvelous tales that circulated through medieval society. His inclusion of the Woolpit story in his chronicle, therefore, carries its own significance, suggesting that he found the account credible enough to merit preservation despite his usual caution. William approached the Green Children with the careful hesitation of a man who knew how easily false stories could gain the appearance of truth. He acknowledged that the tale seemed almost beyond belief, that readers might reasonably doubt whether such things could actually have occurred. Yet he argued that the testimony of so many witnesses, the consistency of the accounts, and the survival of the girl herself as living proof all combined to establish the reality of events that would otherwise seem impossible. His version of the story largely aligned with Ralph's account, though the two chroniclers differed in certain details that have occupied scholars ever since. William placed the events during the reign of King Stephen, while Ralph's chronology was somewhat vaguer. William provided slightly different emphases in his description of the children's appearance and behavior, noting details that Ralph had omitted while passing over points that Ralph had stressed. These variations might reflect different sources, different memories, or simply the natural divergence that occurs when multiple people attempt to capture the same events in words. The differences between the two accounts have themselves become part of the mystery. inviting speculation about what actually happened and how accurately either chronicler captured the truth. Some scholars have argued that the discrepancies undermine the credibility of both versions, suggesting that neither writer had access to reliable information. Others have contended that the variations actually support authenticity, since fabricated stories tend to maintain suspicious consistency, while genuine events, filtered through multiple witnesses and years of retelling, naturally produce divergent accounts. Medieval chroniclers operated according to standards and expectations quite different from those that govern modern historical writing. They saw their task not merely as recording facts, but as preserving examples of divine action in the world, demonstrations of the wonders that God continued to perform among his creation. Strange events, like the appearance of the Green Children, were not simply curiosities to be noted and forgotten, but potential signs of deeper truths, messages from the heavens that demanded interpretation and contemplation. This theological framework shaped how chroniclers approached the stories they recorded, influencing what details they emphasized and what meanings they drew from the events they described. Ralph and William were both churchmen, trained in the interpretation of Scripture and accustomed to finding spiritual significance in worldly happenings. They would have considered the Green Children through this lens, wondering what lesson God intended to teach through such an extraordinary visitation. The monasteries where such chronicles were produced served as the primary repositories of learning and literacy in medieval England. Most people could neither read nor write, and the preservation of knowledge depended upon the scribes who labored in these religious houses, copying manuscripts and composing new works that would carry information forward through time. Without the monks and canons who maintained this tradition, the story of the Green Children would have died with the last person who remembered it, lost forever to the silence that claims all unrecorded history. It's a process by which a story moved from oral tradition into written chronicle involved multiple stages of transmission and transformation. Events occurred and were witnessed by those present. Witnesses told others what they had seen, and those others told still others, the account passing from mouth to mouth across distances of space and time. Eventually, someone with the ability to write encountered the story and decided it merited preservation, setting down in permanent form a narrative that had previously existed only in the memories and voices of its tellers. Each stage of this process introduced opportunities for alteration, whether through the imperfections of memory, the embellishments of skilled storytellers, or the interpretive choices of the chroniclers themselves. By the time Ralph and William wrote their accounts, decades had passed since the children's discovery, and the story had traveled through countless retellings before reaching them. What they recorded was not a direct transcript of events, but a literary construction, shaped by all the voices that had participated in its transmission. This does not mean that their accounts were false or unreliable, merely that they were products of their time and circumstances, subject to the same limitations that affect all historical sources. Modern historians have learned to read medieval chronicles with appropriate caution, recognizing that these texts served purposes beyond simple documentation and that their authors brought assumptions and agendas to their work. The Green Children must be understood within this context. Their story neither accepted uncritically nor dismissed out of hand, but examined with the careful attention it deserves. The survival of the chronicles themselves through the subsequent centuries required its own series of fortunate circumstances. Manuscripts were fragile objects, vulnerable to fire and flood and the simple ravages of time. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII destroyed many of the repositories where such documents had been preserved, scattering collections that had been maintained for generations. Will's accounts survived these upheavals to reach the modern era represents a minor miracle of preservation. Scribes in later centuries copied the chronicles, producing new manuscripts that carried the text forward, even as older copies deteriorated or were lost. Scholars collected and studied these works, recognizing their value as sources for understanding the medieval past. Eventually, the chronicles were printed, their contents made available to audiences far larger than any medieval writer could have anticipated. Oh, the Green Children thus completed a journey from oral tale to manuscript chronicle to printed book, their story preserved at each stage by the efforts of those who found it worthy of continuation. The credibility that medieval audiences assigned to accounts of wonders differed substantially from the skepticism that characterizes modern approaches to similar claims. People in the 12th century lived in a world where miracles were expected occurrences, where saints performed healings, and demons tormented the unwary, and the boundaries between natural and supernatural remained permeable. The appearance of two green-skinned children from an underground realm, while certainly extraordinary, did not violate the fundamental assumptions about reality that governed medieval thought. This does not mean that medieval people were gullible or incapable of critical thinking. They evaluated claims of wonders according to their own criteria, considering the reliability of witnesses, the consistency of accounts, and the conformity of reported events with theological expectations. William of Newburgh explicitly engaged in such evaluation when he included the Green Children in his chronicle, acknowledging doubts while arguing that the evidence supported acceptance. His skepticism was real, even if it operated within a framework quite different from modern scientific naturalism. The Green Children occupied an ambiguous position in medieval categories of the marvelous. They were not clearly miraculous in a religious sense, since their appearance bore no obvious connection to Christian holiness or divine intervention. They were not clearly demonic, since they showed no signs of evil intent or corrupting influence. They seemed to be something else entirely, visitors from a realm that fit neither the heaven of the faithful nor the hell of the damned, but existed in some third space that medieval cosmology struggled to accommodate. This ambiguity may explain why the story attracted the attention of chroniclers who might otherwise have ignored a mere local curiosity. The Green Children posed questions that demanded answers, challenged assumptions that seemed secure, opened possibilities that conventional wisdom had not considered. They were interesting precisely because they did not fit neatly into existing categories, because they required the kind of intellectual engagement that appealed to learned men like Ralph and William. The written accounts produced by these chroniclers became the authoritative sources for all subsequent discussions of the Green Children, cited and quoted and analyzed by generations of writers who never saw the original events, but who could access them through the mediation of text. The story entered the permanent record of English history, taking its place alongside accounts of kings and battles and saints and plagues as part of the documented past. Whatever had actually happened at Woolpit, the chronicle accounts ensured that something would be remembered, that the Green Children would not vanish entirely into the silence of forgotten time. Ralph and William gave the story its literary form, shaping raw material into narratives that could be read and understood and transmitted. They made choices about what to include and what to omit, how to describe and how to interpret, when to express certainty and when to acknowledge doubt. These choices became fixed in their texts, determining how readers for centuries to come would encounter the Green Children and what they would think about this strange episode from the medieval past. The debt we owe to these chroniclers cannot be overstated, for without their efforts we would know nothing of the children who emerged from the wolf pit with green skin and strange tongues, nothing of the girl who survived to tell her tale of twilight lands and underground journeys. They preserved a mystery that continues to fascinate, a story that refuses to be explained away or forgotten, a window into possibilities that stretch beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. Through their words, the Green Children live still, forever emerging from darkness into the blinding light of a world they never expected to find. The mystery of the Green Children has invited explanation from the moment they first emerged from that wolf pit into the astonished gaze of Woolpit's farmers across the centuries since their appearance. Scholars and curious minds have proposed numerous theories to account for what the medieval chroniclers recorded, seeking natural causes that might explain away the seemingly supernatural elements of the tale. These rational interpretations deserve consideration, for they offer possible answers even as they raise new questions of their own. The most thoroughly developed mundane explanation connects the Green Children to the turbulent political circumstances of 12th century England. During the reign of King Stephen, the kingdom suffered through a prolonged civil war that brought misery to many regions and displaced countless families from their homes. Among those caught up in this chaos were communities of Flemish immigrants who had settled in various parts of England, pursuing trades and crafts that made them valuable contributors to the local economy. These Flemish settlers faced persecution at various points during the Civil War, targeted by factions that viewed them as outsiders or exploited them as convenient scapegoats for larger grievances. Historical records document episodes of violence against Flemish communities, including a significant massacre that occurred in the county of Suffolk during the troubled years of Stephen's reign. Men were killed, families were scattered, and survivors fled into the forests and wild places to escape those who hunted them. Consider the possibility that the Green Children were orphans of such persecution, as Flemish youngsters who lost their parents to violence and found themselves alone in an unfamiliar landscape. They would have spoken a language incomprehensible to English villagers, for Flemish bore little resemblance to the tongue of Suffolk's farmers. They would have worn clothing fashioned according to foreign customs, garments that seemed strange to eyes accustomed only to English styles. They would have been disoriented, traumatized, and desperate, wandering through the countryside until chance delivered them into the wolf pit. This theory accounts for many elements of the story, while leaving others unexplained. The foreign language, the unusual clothing, the children's obvious distress all fit comfortably within the Flemish refugee hypothesis. But what of the green skin, the most distinctive and puzzling feature of the entire account? Proponents of the Flemish theory have proposed that the green coloring resulted from a medical condition rather than an otherworldly origin. Chlorosis, sometimes called green sickness, was a form of anemia that could produce a distinctly greenish pallor in those who suffered from it. The condition typically resulted from severe nutritional deficiency, particularly a lack of iron in the diet. Children who had been living rough in the forests, eating whatever they could scavenge while hiding from those who wished them harm, might well have developed such a deficiency. Their skin would have taken on the characteristic greenish tint that gave the condition its name. The restricted diet that the children initially displayed, their willingness to eat only green beans while refusing all other foods, might support this interpretation. Perhaps their damaged digestive systems, weakened by prolonged malnutrition, could only tolerate the simplest and most easily processed foods. Beans are rich in the nutrients that chlorosis sufferers lack, and the children's bodies might have instinctively recognized what they needed, even when their conscious minds could not explain their preferences. As the girl received proper nutrition in the household of Sir Richard de Colin, her condition would have gradually improved. The chlorosis would have resolved as her body rebuilt its depleted stores of essential minerals, and the green tint of her skin would have faded accordingly. What seemed like a mysterious transformation from otherworldly being to ordinary human might have been nothing more than recovery from severe malnutrition, the healing of a body that had been pushed to the edge of survival. The boy's death, tragic as it was, also fits within this framework. Severe malnutrition can cause lasting damage, particularly in young children whose bodies are still developing. Even with proper food, some damage cannot be undone, and the boy may simply have been too far gone to recover. His sister, perhaps slightly older and slightly stronger, possessed just enough resilience to pull through where he could not. Other researchers have proposed variations on the refugee theory, suggesting that the children might have come from isolated communities within England itself, rather than from Flemish settlements. Medieval England contained pockets of population that remained remarkably cut off from the mainstream of society. It's communities that had developed their own dialects and customs through generations of limited contact with the outside world. The vast forest that still covered much of the country could have sheltered such groups, allowing them to maintain ways of life quite different from those of ordinary villages. Children from such an isolated community might have seemed almost as foreign as visitors from another land. Their speech would have diverged significantly from standard English, potentially becoming incomprehensible to outsiders over enough generations of separation. Their clothing would have reflected the materials and techniques available in their forest environment, rather than the fashions of the wider world. Their knowledge of agriculture and food preparation might have been limited to whatever their isolated circumstances allowed. If such children became separated from their community, perhaps through the death of adults who were supposed to be caring for them, or through some accident that left them lost in unfamiliar territory, they might have wandered for considerable distances before encountering the settled regions around Woolpit. Their disorientation would have been genuine, their inability to communicate real, their fear of the strangers who surrounded them entirely understandable. The underground journey that Agnes later described might represent a confused memory of traveling through dense forest, where the canopy blocked out the sun and created a twilight world beneath the trees. A child lost in such an environment might remember it as a passage through darkness, a journey through a realm where normal light did not penetrate. When she finally emerged from the forest edge into open farmland, the sudden brightness of unfiltered sunlight would have been genuinely painful after so long in the dimness beneath the branches. A more recent theory has pointed to environmental contamination as a possible explanation for the children's green coloring. The area around Woolpit contained deposits of various minerals, and mining activities in medieval England often released toxic substances into the local environment. Arsenic, in particular, was present in certain geological formations, and exposure to this element could produce dramatic effects on human health and appearance. Chronic arsenic poisoning can cause changes in skin pigmentation, potentially producing unusual colors in those who have been exposed over extended periods. Children living in an area with contaminated water or soil might have accumulated enough arsenic in their systems to alter their appearance significantly. The green tint, rather than being a natural characteristic of their race or a symptom of malnutrition, might have been a sign of slow poisoning by environmental toxins. This theory would also explain the children's initial inability to eat normal foods. Arsenic exposure can damage the digestive system, causing nausea and food aversion that might manifest as a refusal to eat anything except the most bland and easily tolerated items. As the girl spent time in Woolpit, away from whatever contaminated environment had poisoned her, the arsenic would have gradually cleared from her system. Her appetite would have returned, her skin color would have normalized, and she would have appeared to transform from a strange green creature into an ordinary English girl. The death of the boy might indicate that he had received a higher dose of the toxin, perhaps by drinking more contaminated water or by eating more of whatever poisoned food source the children had access to. Children are more vulnerable to arsenic poisoning than adults, and smaller children are more vulnerable than larger ones. The differential in their responses to removal from the contaminated environment would reflect the differential in their exposures. Critics of these rational explanations have pointed out that each theory explains some elements of the story while struggling with others. The Flemish refugee hypothesis accounts for the language barrier, but requires assuming that medieval observers would have mistaken chlorosis for a genuinely green skin tone. The isolated community theory provides a framework for the cultural differences, but offers no clear mechanism for the underground journey that Agnes described. The arsenic poisoning hypothesis explains the physical symptoms, but raises questions about why no other members of the children's community were similarly affected. Perhaps the most significant challenge to all rational explanations is the testimony of Agnes herself. The account she provided of St. Martin's Land and the journey through caverns and the sound of bells that led her from one world to another. If she was simply a traumatized child from a Flemish community or an isolated forest settlement, why did she construct such an elaborate and consistent alternative narrative? The details she provided do not match any known location in England or on the European continent, and her description of perpetual twilight does not correspond to any real environment that might have been her birthplace. The vendors of rational explanations suggested that Anna's testimony should be understood as a combination of confused memory and later elaboration. A child who had survived severe trauma might have difficulty accurately recalling the events that led to her displacement. Her memories of life before Woolpit would have been fragmentary at best. And as she grew older and learned English, she might have filled in the gaps with imaginative reconstructions that made sense of her experiences. The sound of bells, for instance, might have been a real memory of church bells heard in the distance, transformed by childish imagination into a magical summons that drew her away from home. The underground journey might have been a real passage through caves or tunnels, its duration and nature exaggerated by the terror she felt while traversing it. St. Martin's Land itself might have been a childhood name for whatever community she had come from, or a fiction constructed to explain origins that her adult self no longer clearly remembered. The green beans that saved her life might also have contributed to her later account. The connection between her green skin and her ability to eat only green vegetables could have suggested to her developing mind that she came from a place where everything was green. A land of perpetual verdure that matched the color of her own body. Such creative reconstruction is common among trauma survivors, who often develop narratives that impose meaning and coherence on experiences that were originally chaotic and incomprehensible. None of these rational explanations can be definitively proven, just as none can be definitively disproven. The evidence that survives from the 12th century is simply too limited to allow for certainty about what actually happened. The chronicle accounts, valuable as they are, represent already interpreted versions of events that had passed through multiple retellings before reaching their final written form. Whatever truth lies behind the story of the Green Children remains hidden, accessible only through speculation and imagination. What the rational explanations offer is not proof, but possibility, the demonstration that ordinary causes could potentially account for extraordinary effects. They remind us that the world is more complex than it sometimes appears, that unusual circumstances can produce unusual results without requiring supernatural intervention. The Green Children might have been refugees or lost forest dwellers or victims of environmental poisoning, ordinary humans whose extraordinary circumstances created a story that has fascinated listeners for nearly 1,000 years. Yet, even those who favor rational explanations often acknowledge a lingering uncertainty, a sense that something in the tale resists complete reduction to mundane causes. The mystery of the Green Children seems to exceed any single theory, to contain elements that slip through the net of rational analysis and swim away into deeper waters. Perhaps this is why the story endures, because it refuses to be fully explained, because it preserves a space for wonder in a world that often seems determined to eliminate such spaces entirely, while rational explanations attempt to ground the Green Children in the familiar world of human experience. Other interpretations venture into territory far stranger and more unsettling. Throughout the centuries since their appearance, many have argued that the story should be taken at something closer to face value, that Agnes and her brother truly did come from somewhere beyond the ordinary boundaries of our reality. These supernatural interpretations draw upon ancient traditions of otherworldly beings and hidden realms, finding in the Green Children confirmation of beliefs that stretch back to the earliest days of human culture. The fairy folk occupy a prominent place in the folklore of the British Isles, appearing in tales and traditions that predate the arrival of Christianity and persist in modified forms long for the old religions faded from memory. These beings were not the diminutive winged creatures of Victorian imagination, but something altogether more complex and ambiguous. Entities that existed alongside humanity in a parallel dimension that occasionally intersected with our own. They were neither wholly good nor wholly evil, neither angels nor demons, but something outside the moral categories that Christianity sought to impose upon the supernatural world. The fairies were associated with specific places in the landscape, with certain hills and mounds and ancient sites where the boundary between their realm and ours grew thin. They were said to dwell beneath the earth, in hollow hills and underground palaces where time flowed differently and the rules of ordinary existence did not apply. Travelers who stumbled into their domain might spend what seemed like a single night dancing at a fairy feast, only to return home and discover that years or even generations had passed in their absence. Green was the color most strongly associated with the fairy folk in British tradition. They dressed in green, they favored green surroundings, and those who had contact with them sometimes bore the mark of green upon their persons. This association may have originated in the connection between fairies and the natural world, the forests and meadows where they were believed to dwell. Or it may have reflected something deeper, some quality of the other world itself that manifested in this particular hue. The Green Children fit remarkably well into this tradition of fairy lore. Their coloring marked them immediately as belonging to the realm of the fair folk, as visitors from that parallel world that existed just beyond the edge of human perception. Their emergence from underground, from a pit dug into the earth, suggested that they had somehow crossed the boundary between their subterranean realm and the surface world where mortals conducted their ordinary lives. Their inability to tolerate sunlight, their unfamiliarity with common foods, their incomprehensible language all pointed toward an origin outside the bounds of normal human experience. Agnes's description of St. Martin's Land resonated with accounts of the fairy realm found throughout Celtic and Germanic folklore. The perpetual twilight she described matched the timeless quality attributed to the other world, where day and night did not alternate in their familiar rhythm, and the passage of hours held no meaning. The luminous country, visible across the great river, might have been some higher realm within the fairy hierarchy, a place of even greater power and strangeness than the twilight land where she had been born. The sound of bells that drew the children from their home and into the cavern passage carried its own symbolic weight within this interpretive framework. Bells held powerful significance in medieval thought, their sound believed capable of driving away evil spirits and marking the sacred boundaries of Christian space. If the Green Children were fairy beings, the bells of an English church might have exercised an irresistible attraction, drawing them toward the mortal world despite the dangers that awaited them there. Some versions of fairy tradition held that these beings lacked souls and therefore envied humans who possessed the promise of eternal salvation. Fairies were said to steal human children, partly to introduce mortal blood into their own lineages, hoping to acquire through such unions the spiritual substance they themselves lacked. The Green Children's journey might represent the inverse of this pattern. Fairy young drawn toward the human world by a longing for something their own realm could not provide. Agnes's eventual baptism and integration into Christian society takes on additional significance within this framework. By accepting the sacraments of the church, she may have gained the soul that her fairy nature had previously denied her, completing a transformation from otherworldly being to genuine human. Her marriage and the birth of apparently normal children would then represent the fulfillment of whatever purpose had driven her from St. Martin's Land, the successful acquisition of full humanity through her sojourn in the mortal world. Beyond the fairy interpretation lies an even more dramatic possibility, one that has gained adherents in more recent centuries as new frameworks for understanding the unknown have emerged. The hollow earth theory, which proposes that our planet contains vast cavities or even entire worlds beneath its outer surface, offers another way of reading the Green Children's story. Est. Martin's Land was not a mystical fairy realm, but a physical place, a civilization existing in the hollow interior of the earth itself. This interpretation takes Agnes's account of underground travel quite literally, prosing that she and her brother journeyed through passages that connected their subterranean homeland with the surface world above. The perpetual twilight of St. Martin's Land might result from the absence of direct sunlight in the hollow earth, where illumination came from some internal source rather than from the sun that lights our skies. The children's sensitivity to surface sunlight would then reflect their adaptation to the dimmer conditions of their underground environment. The hollow earth theory enjoyed considerable popularity in the 19th and early 20th centuries, attracting serious scientific speculation before being definitively disproved by modern geological knowledge. Yet, its appeal persists in certain circles, and the Green Children continue to be cited as potential evidence for the existence of subterranean civilizations. Their story seems to offer first-hand testimony from someone who had actually made the journey between inner and outer Earth, emerging from the depths to provide a glimpse of what lay below. A related but distinct interpretation places the Green Children's origin not underground, but in a parallel dimension, a reality that exists alongside our own, but remains normally invisible and inaccessible. Modern physics has introduced concepts like multiple dimensions and parallel universes that provide new vocabulary for ideas that folklore had explored for millennia. Perhaps St. Martin's Land occupies one of these parallel realms, a world separated from ours, not by physical distance, but by some fundamental difference in the nature of reality itself. The cavern passage that Agnes described might then represent not a physical tunnel, but a point of intersection between dimensions, a place where the barriers separating parallel worlds grew thin enough to permit crossing. Such intersections might occur unpredictably, opening and closing according to laws that neither realm fully understands. The children stumbled through at a moment when the passage stood open, only to find themselves trapped in our world when the connection closed behind them. This parallel dimension interpretation helps explain some of the more puzzling elements of Agnes's testimony. The luminous country visible across the river from St. Martin's Land might be yet another parallel realm, visible from her homeland, but unreachable through ordinary travel. The church bells that drew her toward the passage might have been sounds bleeding through from our dimension, audible in St. Martin's Land, even though no physical bells existed there. The different physics of her home dimension might account for the green coloring that faded once she had spent sufficient time, subject to the conditions of our own reality. The symbolism of green extends far beyond the specific traditions of fairy folklore, carrying meanings that resonate across many cultures and historical periods. Green is the color of growing things, of life renewed after winter's death, of the vegetable kingdom that sustains all animal existence. It is also the color of decay, of mold and rot, and the breakdown that follows the end of life, the shade that marks the transition between living and dead matter. In alchemical traditions, green represented the raw material of transformation, the prima materia from which higher substances could be extracted through proper processes. The green lion was a symbol of the devouring force that consumed ordinary matter to prepare it for spiritual refinement. A green child might therefore symbolize potential awaiting actualization, a being in transition between one state of existence and another. Celtic mythology associated green with the other world and with those beings who traveled between realms. The Green Knight of Arthurian legend carried this symbolism, his emerald coloring, marking him as a figure from beyond the ordinary boundaries of mortal existence. When he survived beheading and challenged Sir Gawain to a game of exchanges, he demonstrated the different rules that governed those who came from the green realm. Germanic traditions similarly connected green with supernatural beings and with the wild forces of nature that civilization struggled to contain. The Green Man, whose foliate face appears carved in countless medieval churches, represented the untamed vitality of the natural world, the power of growth and renewal that Christianity sought to baptize without entirely suppressing. The Green Children might be understood as representatives of this same vital force, emissaries from the wild heart of nature who briefly entered the human world before being domesticated, educated through baptism and marriage. The persistence of these supernatural interpretations across so many centuries suggests that they address something real in human experience, even if that something cannot be captured by the categories of empirical science. Perhaps the Green Children represent not an actual event, but a symbolic truth, a story that expresses in narrative form insights about the nature of reality that ordinary language cannot directly convey. Every culture has traditions of visitors from other realms, of beings who cross the boundaries between worlds and bring news of what lies beyond. These figures serve as reminders that the visible world does not exhaust reality, that there are more things in heaven and earth than any philosophy has fully dreamed. The Green Children take their place in this long tradition, offering a specific and compelling instance of contact with the unknown that resonates with deep human intuitions about the hidden dimensions of existence. Whether one accepts the supernatural interpretations as literally true or views them as metaphorical expressions of psychological and spiritual truths, they offer something that rational explanations cannot provide. They preserve the mystery, maintain the sense of wonder, refuse to reduce the strange to the familiar. They insist that the world contains depths that cannot be fully plumbed, that surprises remain possible even in an age that prides itself on having explained everything worth explaining. The fairy folk may not exist in any scientifically verifiable sense. The hollow earth has been definitively disproved, and parallel dimensions remain theoretical constructs that may or may not correspond to actual features of reality. Yet, the stories that invoke these concepts continue to exercise their power, continue to attract those who feel that purely rational accounts leave something essential unexplained. The Green Children serve as a focal point for this enduring hunger for mystery, a story capacious enough to accommodate interpretations that range from the mundane to the transcendent. In the end, perhaps the supernatural interpretations are valuable not because they are true in any simple, factual sense, but because they are meaningful in ways that facts alone cannot capture. They speak to the parts of human experience that lie beyond the reach of measurement and calculation, the intuitions and longings and half-glimpsed possibilities that make life more than mere biological functioning. The Green Children, whether they were fairies or hollow earth dwellers or dimensional travelers or something else entirely, remind us that wonder has its own validity. That mystery is not merely ignorance waiting to be dispelled, but a fundamental quality of existence that deserves respect and even celebration. The story of the Green Children did not remain confined to the Latin chronicles, where it was first recorded but spread outward through the centuries, finding new audiences and inspiring new tellings in each generation that encountered it. From medieval manuscripts to modern novels, from scholarly analyses to popular entertainments, the tale has demonstrated a remarkable capacity to adapt itself to changing times while retaining the essential mystery that makes it compelling. This cultural legacy represents perhaps the most tangible evidence of the story's power. The proof that something in the account of those two strange visitors continues to resonate with human minds across vast distances of time and circumstance. The earliest retellings simply copied or paraphrased the chronicle accounts, transmitting the story through the networks of literacy that connected medieval TVO, monasteries, and later the emerging universities of Europe. Scholars who encountered the tale in Ralph of Coggeshall or William of Newburgh referenced it in their own works, ensuring that knowledge of the Green Children spread beyond the immediate vicinity of their appearance. By the time the medieval period drew to a close, the story had become part of the general fund of wonders that educated Europeans could be expected to know. The advent of printing accelerated this process of dissemination, making the chronicle accounts available to audiences far larger than any medieval copyist could have reached. The Green Children appeared in collections of curiosities and wonders, taking their place alongside accounts of monstrous births, miraculous healings, and other events that challenged ordinary expectations about the nature of reality. These early printed books brought the story to readers throughout Europe, translating the Latin originals into vernacular languages and introducing the Green Children to populations that had never heard of Woolpit or Suffolk. The Enlightenment brought new approaches to the tale. as rationalist thinkers attempted to strip away the supernatural elements and identify the mundane causes behind the reported events. The theories about Flemish refugees and medical conditions emerged during this period, reflecting the broader cultural project of explaining away mysteries that previous generations had accepted as genuine encounters with the unknown. Yet even those who proposed rational explanations often acknowledged the fascination of the story itself, recognizing that something in the tale transcended the question of its literal truth. Romantic era writers rediscovered the Green Children as part of their broader enthusiasm for folklore and the supernatural. The story fit perfectly with romantic interests in the mysterious, the medieval, and the imaginative possibilities that rationalism had tried to suppress. Poets and novelists found in the tale material for explorations of otherness and transformation, using the Green Children as symbols for the alienation of the artist or the longing for transcendence that characterized romantic sensibility. The 19th century also saw the first serious attempts to investigate the story using modern historical methods. Antiquarians traveled to Woolpit to examine a site where the children had allegedly been discovered, interviewed local residents about traditions that might have been passed down through the generations, and searched archives for documents that might shed additional light on the events. These investigations produced mixed results, copying some elements of the chronicle accounts while raising new questions about others. The village of Woolpit itself became a destination for those curious about the Green Children, a place of pilgrimage for seekers of mystery who wished to stand where the two strange figures had first emerged into the light of an English morning. The wolf pits that gave the village its name had long since been filled in, or had collapsed, leaving no physical trace of the traps where the children had been found. Yet the landscape retained its power to evoke the past. The fields and forests surrounding the village still capable of suggesting the medieval world in which the extraordinary events had occurred. The parish church of St. Mary became a repository for Green Children traditions, preserving memories and artifacts connected to the story that had made the village famous. Visitors could see the ancient building where Agnes had received her baptism, could walk the same lanes she had walked during her years in Sir Richard de Colin's household. The village sign, erected in more recent times, depicts the two Green Children, ensuring that every traveler who passes through Woolpit encounters a reminder of its most famous residents. Local businesses have embraced the connection to the Green Children, naming establishments and products after the legendary visitors. The story has become part of the village's identity, a source of pride and a draw for tourists who might otherwise have no reason to visit this quiet corner of Suffolk. What began as a strange occurrence nearly 9 centuries ago has transformed into an economic and cultural resource, keeping Woolpit on the map when countless other medieval villages have faded into obscurity. The 20th century brought new waves of interest in the Green Children as changing cultural conditions created new contexts for interpreting their story. The emergence of science fiction as a popular genre suggested extraterrestrial explanations would never have occurred to medieval or early modern interpreters. Perhaps the children were aliens, visitors from another planet who had somehow arrived in 12th century England. Their green skin might reflect the biology of their home world, their incomprehensible language, and extraterrestrial tongue. Their underground journey, a passage through some kind of interstellar transportation system. This interpretation gained adherents among those who believed that Earth had been visited by beings from other worlds throughout human history. The Green Children took their place alongside other alleged evidence for ancient astronauts, cited in books and documentaries that proposed extraterrestrial explanations for mysteries that conventional scholarship could not resolve. Whether or not one accepts such theories, they demonstrate the story's capacity to attract new interpretations as human knowledge and imagination expand. Literary adaptations have explored the Green Children from multiple angles, reimagining their story through the lens of fiction. Novels have been written from Agnes's perspective, attempting to capture the experience of a child torn from one world and thrust into another. Short stories have used the tale as a starting point for explorations of alienation, identity, and the possibility of transformation. Playwrights have dramatized the events at Woolpit, bringing the Green Children to life on stages where audiences can witness their emergence and adaptation. One particularly influential adaptation came from the pen of Herbert Reed, a 20th century poet and critic who published a novel based on the legend. His work reimagined the story through a modernist sensibility, using the Green Children as vehicles for exploring themes of innocence, experience, and the relationship between the natural and civilized worlds. Reed's novel introduced the tale to readers who might never have encountered the medieval sources, ensuring that new generations would discover and engage with the mystery. The Green Children have also appeared in music, with composers and songwriters drawing upon the legend for inspiration. Folk musicians have found in the tale material suited to the traditions of ballad and storytelling song, while more experimental artists have used it as a basis for works that push the boundaries of conventional musical forms. The story seems to lend itself to artistic expression across multiple media, its images and themes proving adaptable to whatever form creative minds choose to impose upon them. Academic interest in the Green Children has continued into the present day, with scholars from various disciplines offering new analyses and interpretations. Historians have re-examined the chronicle accounts in light of improved understanding of medieval society and textual traditions. Folklorists have traced connections between the Woolpit tale and similar legends from other times and places. Psychologists have proposed interpretations based on modern understanding of trauma, memory, and the construction of personal narrative. These similar legends deserve attention, for the Green Children are not unique in the annals of mysterious appearances. Stories of strange children emerging from underground or appearing from unknown origins exist in traditions throughout the world, suggesting either remarkable coincidences or some underlying pattern in human experience that generates such tales across cultural boundaries. The parallels and differences between these accounts offer additional material for those seeking to understand what the Green Children might represent. In the mountains of Spain, a legend tells of two green-skinned children who emerged from a cave near the village of Banjos in the 19th century. The details of this story closely parallel the Woolpit account, including the children's initial inability to eat local food and their gradual loss of green coloring over time. Some researchers have suggested that the Spanish legend may be a transplanted version of the English tale carried across Europe through channels of folklore transmission. Others argue that the similarities indicate a common source or experience underlying both stories. Japanese folklore contains accounts of children appearing from the sea or from underground, beings who do not quite fit the category of ordinary human and who must be carefully integrated into village life. Native American traditions include stories of people who live beneath the earth, occasionally emerging to interact with surface dwellers before returning to their subterranean homes. African and Australian mythologies preserve tales of beings from other realms who cross into the human world, sometimes permanently and sometimes only for brief visits. These cross-cultural parallels suggest that the Green Children tap into something fundamental in human psychology, some archetypal pattern that manifests in similar stories regardless of specific cultural context. The figure of the mysterious child from elsewhere seems to express universal concerns about identity, belonging, and the boundaries between the known and unknown. Every culture must grapple with questions about where people come from and where they go, about what lies beyond the edges of the familiar world, about how to respond when the strange intrudes upon the ordinary. The enduring grip that the Green Children exercise upon imagination reflects the story's capacity to evoke these deep concerns while leaving them ultimately unresolved. Unlike tales that provide clear answers and tidy conclusions, the Woolpit legend maintains its mystery across centuries of interpretation. Every explanation proposed raises new questions. Every theory offered leaves some element unaccounted for. The story resists closure, inviting endless return and renewed engagement from each generation that encounters it. Modern media have found in the Green Children material suited to contemporary formats and sensibilities. Television documentaries have examined the legend, presenting the various theories and allowing viewers to draw their own conclusions. Internet forums host ongoing discussions about what the children might have been and where they might have come from. Social media spreads awareness of the tale to audiences who might never have encountered it through traditional channels. The village of Woolpit continues to welcome visitors who come seeking connection to the mystery, offering a physical location where the abstract legend can be grounded in concrete experience. Standing in the Suffolk countryside, looking out over fields that have been cultivated for centuries, I can almost imagine the morning when farmers making their rounds discovered something impossible in a wolf pit at the edge of the forest. The landscape has changed since then, but the essential character of the place remains, rural and quiet, and somehow removed from the rush of modern life. Perhaps this is part of why the Green Children continue to fascinate, because their story offers an escape from the disenchanted world that modernity has created. In an age when every corner of the earth has been mapped and photographed, when satellites can track movement across the entire surface of the planet, when science claims to have explained or to be on the verge of explaining every mystery worth explaining, the Green Children represent a stubborn reminder that things once happened that do not fit our categories. They are a door that refuses to close, a window that remains open onto possibilities we are not quite ready to abandon. The cultural legacy of the Green Children will likely continue to grow as new generations discover the tale and find in it meanings relevant to their own times and concerns. The story has already demonstrated its capacity to adapt, to acquire new interpretations while shedding none of its old ones, to remain perpetually fresh despite nearly 9 centuries of telling and retelling. Whatever they actually were, the 2 children who emerged from a wolf pit in 12th century Suffolk have achieved a kind of immortality, living on in human memory and imagination long after their physical bodies return to the earth. As we reach the end of this long journey through the mystery of the Green Children, we find ourselves standing at the boundary between what can be known and what must remain forever uncertain. The story has carried us through medieval villages and chronicle accounts, through rational explanations and supernatural interpretations, through centuries of cultural transmission and adaptation. Yet, for all the words that have been written and all the theories that have been proposed, the essential mystery remains intact, a quiet presence at the heart of the tale that refuses to yield its secrets to even the most determined inquiry. There is something profoundly appropriate about this resistance to final explanation, something that speaks to the nature of mystery itself and its place in human experience. We live in an age that prizes certainty, that values answers over questions and solutions over problems. The scientific method has trained us to expect that every puzzle can be solved, every unknown transformed into knowledge through the proper application of reason and evidence. Yet, the Green Children remind us that some things lie beyond the reach of these powerful tools, that the world contains depths that cannot be fully plumbed, no matter how sophisticated our instruments become. The boundary between history and myth proves remarkably difficult to draw when we examine tales like this one. We have chronicle accounts written by educated men who claimed access to reliable sources, who expressed their own doubts while ultimately concluding that the events they recorded had actually occurred. We have details that seem too specific to be purely invented, names and places and circumstances that anchor the story in a particular time and location. Yet, we also have elements that strain credibility beyond what most modern minds can comfortably accept. Green-skinned children in twilight realms and underground journeys that seem to belong to the world of fairy tales rather than historical record. Perhaps the distinction between history and myth is itself less clear than we typically assume. Human beings have always told stories to make sense of their experiences, and the line between factual reporting and narrative elaboration has never been as sharp as we might like to believe. The medieval chroniclers, who recorded the Green Children operated within a framework that did not draw the same boundaries we draw, that saw the marvelous and the mundane as continuous rather than categorically distinct. Their accounts may preserve genuine historical information wrapped in layers of interpretation and embellishment that we can no longer reliably separate. What the tale reveals about medieval consciousness deserves contemplation. For the story could only have emerged from a particular kind of mind operating within a particular kind of world. The people of 12th century England inhabited a universe saturated with meaning, where every event potentially carried significance beyond its immediate appearance, and where the boundaries of the possible extended far beyond what modern science would permit. They believed in miracles and demons, in saints and fairies, in a cosmos animated by forces both visible and invisible. This medieval worldview is often dismissed as primitive or superstitious, a stage of human development that we have thankfully outgrown through the advance of reason and knowledge. Yet, there is another way to understand it. It's a recognition of dimensions of experience that our more narrowly focused modern consciousness tends to overlook. The medieval mind was perhaps more willing to acknowledge uncertainty, more comfortable with mystery, more open to the possibility that reality exceeded human capacity to comprehend it fully. The Green Children emerged into this consciousness as a kind of gift. It's an eruption of the unknown that confirmed what medieval people already suspected about the nature of existence. Their appearance demonstrated that the world contained more than could be accounted for by ordinary experience, that somewhere beyond the familiar boundaries of village and field and forest lay realms stranger than imagination could anticipate. They validated the intuition that reality was deeper and wider than it appeared, that the visible surface of things concealed depths that occasionally broke through into human awareness. We who live in a later age have largely lost this sense of comfortable mystery, this ability to accept the unknown without demanding its immediate conversion into knowledge. Our response to what we do not understand is typically to investigate it, to analyze and explain, and ultimately to domesticate it within our existing frameworks. When something resists such domestication, we tend either to deny its reality or to file it away as a problem for future solution. We have forgotten how to simply dwell with mystery, to appreciate its presence without feeling compelled to eliminate it. The story of the Green Children offers an opportunity to recover something of this lost capacity, to practice a different relationship with the unknown than the one our culture typically encourages. As we listen to the tale unfold, we can allow ourselves to wonder without demanding answers, to contemplate without insisting on conclusions. We can let the mystery be what it is, neither accepting nor rejecting it, but simply holding it in awareness as a reminder of how much lies beyond our understanding. A strange but genuine consolation that comes from acknowledging the limits of human knowledge. The Green Children are not threatening figures, despite their strangeness, not harbingers of doom or agents of destruction. They are simply visitors from elsewhere, travelers who stumbled into our world through channels we cannot map, and who left behind a story that has outlived them by centuries. Their mystery is gentle rather than terrifying, an invitation to wonder rather than a source of fear. This gentleness matters, for not all unknowns are equal in their emotional impact. Some mysteries disturb, keeping us awake with anxieties about what might be lurking in the darkness. Others comfort, assuring us that the universe is larger and stranger and more interesting than our small lives might otherwise suggest. The Green Children belong to this second category, their story evoking not dread, but fascination. Not horror, but a kind of wistful longing for the realms they might have represented. Perhaps this is why the tale has proven so enduring, why generation after generation has returned to it despite the impossibility of reaching any final resolution. The Green Children offer an experience that modern life rarely provides, an encounter with the genuinely unknown that does not demand resolution or action, but simply asks to be contemplated. In a world of constant information and perpetual explanation, they represent a pocket of irreducible mystery, a space where questions can remain questions without losing their value. The hours of darkness have always been friendly to such contemplation. It's a time when the business of the day recedes, and the mind can wander freely through territories that daylight consciousness tends to ignore. Lying in the quiet of the night, listening to stories of wonders and mysteries, we reconnect with something ancient in human experience, something that our ancestors knew well, but that we have largely forgotten. The Green Children belong to this nocturnal realm, their tale suited to the hours when the boundary between waking and sleeping grows thin, and the imagination opens to possibilities that reason would normally exclude. As sleep approaches, the story settles into something deeper than mere entertainment or information. It becomes a companion for the journey into unconsciousness, a gentle presence that accompanies us across the threshold between waking and dreaming. It's images of green-skinned children in twilight lands, of wolf pits and underground passages, blend with the natural imagery of the drifting mind, becoming part of the landscape through which we travel as awareness gradually releases its grip on the waking world. In dreams, perhaps, we might catch glimpses of St. Martin's Land, might walk for a time in that perpetual twilight where Agnes and her brother spent their early years. Dreams have their own logic, their own relationship with the unknown, and they welcome visitors from stories in ways that waking consciousness cannot match. The Green Children have traveled through many minds during the centuries since their appearance, and each dreaming consciousness that receives them adds something to the ongoing life of their mystery. The boy who died so soon after his arrival never had the chance to tell his own story, never learned enough English to share what he remembered of their homeland and their journey. His silence remains part of the mystery, a gap in the account that can never be filled. Yet, perhaps, silence is itself a kind of communication, a reminder that not everything can be put into words, that some experiences exceed the capacity of language to capture. His brief life in England ended in that silence, and his unmarked grave in the Woolpit churchyard keeps its secret still. Agnes spoke, and through her speech we have what knowledge we possess of St. Martin's Land and the circumstances that brought the children into our world. Yet, even her testimony raises as many questions as it answers. Her account filtered through the limitations of memory and language and the interpretive frameworks of those who recorded her words. She did her best to communicate what she had experienced, but the experience itself belonged to a realm that English words could only approximate. She lived out her days as an ordinary woman, wife and mother, a member of a community that eventually forgot the strangeness of her origins. The green girl became Agnes of Lynn, her otherworldly appearance fading into the unremarkable complexion of any English peasant. If she dreamed of St. Martin's Land in her later years, if she sometimes heard in memory the sound of bells calling her toward caverns that led between worlds, she left no record of such experiences. Her silence in these matters is as eloquent as any testimony, suggesting depths of inner life that no chronicle could capture. The mystery she embodied did not die with her, but passed into the keeping of all those who would hear her story and wonder at its meaning. We who listen tonight are part of that long chain of transmission, receivers of a tale that began nearly 900 years ago and shows no signs of ending. By attending to the Green Children, by allowing their story to enter our awareness and accompany us toward sleep, we participate in the preservation of something precious, a thread of wonder connecting us to all those who have wondered before us. Let the mystery rest now, neither solved nor dismissed, but simply present, a gentle companion for the journey into night. The Green Children have told us what they can, have shared through the mediation of chroniclers and storytellers, and countless retellings the essence of their strange passage through our world. Remains beyond telling belongs to realms we cannot enter while waking, territories that open only when consciousness releases its grip and allows the deeper mind to wander freely. Sleep comes as it always comes, gradually, and then all at once, carrying us across the threshold into regions as mysterious in their way as any twilight land. The Green Children wait there perhaps, or something like them, figures from the bordered territories where the known and unknown meet and mingle. They have nothing to fear from us, and we have nothing to fear from them. They are simply fellow travelers in the vast mystery of existence, companions for a night and for all the nights to come. The fields of Woolpit lie quiet under stars that have shone since long before any human walked the earth. The wolf pits have vanished, filled in, and forgotten, their locations lost to all but the most dedicated researchers. Yet something lingers there still. Some trace of the wonder that once emerged from the earth to astonish farmers and perplex scholars and enchant all those who hear the tale. The Green Children are still arriving, still emerging from darkness into light, still standing bewildered and blinking in a world they never expected to find. Their story continues, as long as there are minds to receive it and voices to pass it on. And now the telling is complete, the journey finished, the mystery delivered into your keeping for safekeeping through the night. May your sleep be peaceful and your dreams be gentle, touched perhaps by memories of twilight lands and the distant sound of bells calling across boundaries that consciousness cannot cross. The Green Children have found their rest. May you find yours as well in the comfort of mysteries that do not threaten but only wonder, that do not demand but only invite, that do not disturb but only softly bless.